The moment Ethan Whitmore saw the pregnant cleaner kneeling on the marble floor of his hotel, he realized money could buy buildings, power, and silence, but not a second chance. The sound of rolling suitcase wheels echoed through the grand lobby of the Whitmore Regency Hotel as businessmen in tailored suits crossed beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most American homes. The scent of expensive cologne and fresh lilies filled the air. At exactly 8:12 p.m., billionaire investor Ethan Whitmore stepped through the revolving doors wearing a charcoal cashmere coat draped perfectly over his broad shoulders. At 38, Ethan carried the kind of quiet authority that made people lower their voices when he entered a room. Hotel managers straightened their posture. Employees avoided eye contact. Guests whispered his name like he belonged on magazine covers instead of real life. Ethan barely noticed any of it anymore. His life had become an endless cycle of board meetings, acquisitions, private flights, and empty penthouse dinners overlooking Manhattan. Success had made him rich. It had also made him cold. "Mr. Whitmore, the investors from Chicago already arrived," his assistant said quickly while keeping pace beside him in 6-inch heels. "The ballroom is ready for tomorrow's presentation." Ethan gave a distracted nod while checking messages on his phone. Numbers. Contracts. More numbers. Then suddenly, a sharp metallic sound cut through the polished atmosphere. Clink. His platinum watch slipped from his hand and hit the marble floor before sliding several feet across the lobby. Time seemed to slow. A pregnant woman in a pale gray housekeeping uniform bent down carefully to pick it up before anyone stepped on it. Her movements were slow, protective, one hand instinctively supporting the curve of her stomach beneath the oversized uniform. Ethan stopped walking. Completely. The woman held the watch in trembling fingers. White cleaning gloves. Worn sneakers. A loose braid falling over one shoulder. Then she looked up. Claire Donovan. His ex-wife. The air left Ethan's lungs so violently it felt like he'd been punched from the inside. 2 years. 2 years since. The divorce papers. 2 years since she walked out of his penthouse carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and shattered dignity. 2 years since he convinced himself leaving her was necessary for his future. But this wasn't the woman he remembered. Claire had once worn silk dresses at charity galas beside him. She used to laugh easily, her green eyes glowing under Manhattan rooftop lights while cameras flashed around them. Now her face looked thinner. Exhausted. There were faint dark circles beneath her eyes, and her wedding ring was gone. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered softly as she handed him the watch without meeting his eyes for more than half a second. Her voice was calm, but her hands shook slightly from either exhaustion or fear. Ethan stared at her stomach. 7 months pregnant. Maybe 8. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Claire took a small step backward immediately after returning the watch, almost like she already knew he didn't belong in her world anymore. Around them, the lobby noise continued. Guests laughed near the bar. A pianist played soft jazz near the restaurant entrance. But Ethan heard none of it. Because all he could see was the woman he once promised forever, wearing a housekeeping badge with someone else's fingerprints smudged across it while carrying a child he knew nothing about. Claire lowered her eyes the second Ethan took the watch from her trembling hands, but the damage was already done. He had seen everything. The faded housekeeping uniform hanging loosely from her shoulders. The exhaustion she could no longer hide beneath makeup. The rounded stomach beneath cheap gray fabric. And worst of all, the quiet look in her eyes that told him she expected nothing from him anymore. "Thank you for returning it, ma'am," the hotel manager suddenly interrupted with an awkward smile, clearly unaware of the storm unfolding between them. "Mr. Whitmore, we deeply apologize for any inconvenience." Ethan barely heard him. His eyes stayed fixed on Claire as she adjusted the cleaning cart beside her. The wheels squeaked softly against the marble floor. Such a small sound. But somehow it shattered something inside him more than shouting ever could. Claire used to hate silence. 2 years ago she filled every room with warmth. Sunday mornings in their penthouse smelled like cinnamon pancakes and fresh coffee because she insisted breakfast should feel like home no matter how rich they became. She used to sit barefoot near the giant windows overlooking Central Park while reading baby names aloud from her phone, laughing every time Ethan pretended to hate the ridiculous ones. Back then he thought there would always be more time. More dinners. More anniversaries. More chances to choose her later. Billionaires live under the illusion that life waits for them. It does not. Claire slowly pushed the card away, but Ethan finally spoke. Claire. Just her name. Quiet. Careful. Like he was afraid it might break. She stopped walking for half a second before turning slightly toward him. I am working right now, Mr. Whitmore. Not Ethan. Mr. Whitmore. The distance between those two names suddenly felt wider than the entire lobby. You work here? He asked stupidly, immediately hating himself for how detached he sounded. Claire gave a small nod. Night shift housekeeping. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. This hotel was one of the most expensive properties in Manhattan. Celebrities stayed here. Politicians booked entire floors. Presidential suites cost $6,000 a night. And somehow his ex-wife was cleaning toilets inside the empire he built while carrying a child. How long? He asked quietly. Claire hesitated. 8 months. 8 months. Ethan's chest tightened. That meant she had started here shortly after the divorce. His assistant shifted uncomfortably nearby while pretending to check her tablet. Even the employees behind the front desk sensed something deeply wrong was happening. Claire adjusted the strap of her cleaning apron and tried to move again, but suddenly her hand pressed briefly against her lower back. A tiny motion. Almost invisible. Yet Ethan noticed immediately. Pain. Pregnancy exhaustion. She looked pale beneath the bright hotel lights. You should sit down, he said instinctively. Claire almost laughed at that. Not a warm laugh. Not the one he remembered. This one sounded tired. People like me do not get paid to sit down. The sentence hit harder than any accusation could have. Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but another voice interrupted from across the lobby. Claire, room 1812 needs service before midnight. A supervisor in a navy blazer walked briskly toward them carrying a clipboard. Her expression softened slightly when she noticed Claire's condition. Are you okay? Claire forced a smile. I am fine. She was clearly not fine. Ethan could see it now. The dark circles under her eyes were worse up close. Her wedding ring finger looked bare and thinner than before. Even her sneakers were worn at the soles from standing too many hours. This was not survival. This was desperation dressed in politeness. The supervisor finally recognized Ethan and nearly panicked. Mr. Whitmore, I am so sorry, sir. Claire is one of our hardest workers. We usually do not allow employees this far into the VIP entrance during Investor Week. Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. Usually? The woman swallowed nervously. She picked up an extra shift tonight. Ethan looked back at Claire. You are working overtime? Claire stayed quiet for a moment before answering softly. Babies are expensive in New York. Babies. Plural? No. Maybe she just meant pregnancy in general. But something about the way she said it made Ethan's pulse slow unnaturally. Before he could ask another question, Claire suddenly reached for the edge of the cleaning cart. Her balance shifted slightly. Just for a second. But Ethan stepped forward instantly. Claire. I said I am fine. Her voice cracked this time. Not from anger. From exhaustion. Then, as if the universe wanted to punish Ethan one moment at a time, a folded ultrasound photo slipped from the pocket of Claire's apron and landed face up on the polished marble floor directly between them. The entire lobby seemed to stop breathing. The ultrasound photo slid across the marble floor until it stopped beside Ethan's polished Italian shoes. Nobody moved. Not the hotel manager. Not the nervous supervisor. Not even the pianist near the restaurant entrance. Claire reacted first. Her face lost all color as she bent down. Quickly to grab the image, but Ethan reached it at the same time. His fingers touched the corner of the photograph before hers did. For one suspended second, both of them held it together. Then Ethan saw the image clearly. A tiny profile. A small curved head. One fragile life growing inside the woman he once promised to protect. His throat tightened instantly. Claire pulled the photo back against her chest and stepped away from him. "Please do not," she whispered quietly. Ethan looked at her like he no longer recognized the world around him. "Claire!" Her eyes glistened beneath the hotel lights, but she refused to let the tears fall. "I have to finish my shift." She turned the cleaning cart sharply and walked toward the service hallway before he could stop her. Ethan stood frozen in the center of the lobby while investors and guests passed around him in expensive coats and polished shoes. None of them understood that the billionaire owner of the hotel suddenly looked like a man watching his entire life collapse in slow motion. 8 months. The number echoed in his head again and again. 8 months working overnight while pregnant. 8 months hiding from him. 8 months carrying his child alone. His assistant carefully stepped closer. "Sir, the investors are waiting upstairs." Ethan did not answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the hallway where Claire disappeared. Then finally he spoke. "Cancel the meeting." The assistant blinked in shock. "Sir?" "All of it." His voice was low now. Dangerous in a different way than usual. Not angry. Broken. Ethan Whitmore had cancelled billion-dollar negotiations before, but never for personal reasons. Tonight nothing inside him felt more important than understanding how Claire Donovan ended up pushing a cleaning cart through his hotel at nearly midnight, while carrying his baby. 30 minutes later Ethan stood alone inside the hotel security office surrounded by glowing surveillance screens. The head of hotel security looked nervous beside him. "You wanted footage of employee hallways, sir?" Ethan nodded once. "Show me Claire Donovan's shifts." The man typed quickly. Cameras flickered across the monitors. Different dates. Different nights. Different versions of Claire. Ethan watched in silence as the woman he used to know became almost unrecognizable frame by frame. There she was carrying fresh towels down endless hallways at 2 in the morning. Scrubbing bathroom mirrors while quietly holding her lower back in pain. Eating instant noodles alone in the employee break room beside vending machines buzzing under fluorescent lights. Sometimes she sat for only 3 minutes before another shift began. 3 minutes. That was all she allowed herself to rest. Ethan leaned forward slowly, his jaw tightening harder with every second. "How often does she work?" The security manager checked records nervously. 6 nights a week recently. Sometimes doubles. "While pregnant?" "She asked for extra hours, sir." Ethan stared at the screen again. Claire appeared in one camera angle near the loading dock wrapped in a thin coat, while snow drifted across the alley outside. She looked exhausted. Cold. Small. One hand rubbed her stomach gently while she waited for the employee bus after midnight. Ethan suddenly remembered the winter coat he bought her during their second Christmas together. White cashmere. She laughed because he spent $4,000 on something she insisted looked exactly like cheaper versions online. "You cannot solve everything with money, Ethan," she told him that night while smiling into his chest. God. He would give every dollar back now just to hear her laugh one more time. Another camera angle appeared. Claire stood near a housekeeping closet speaking quietly with an older employee. Ethan increased the volume. "You should not be lifting these carts in your condition," the woman said kindly. Claire gave a tired smile. "Rent does not stop because you are pregnant. What about the baby's father?" Silence. Then Claire answered softly enough that Ethan almost missed it. "He already chose another life." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second like the words physically hurt him. Because they did. 2 years ago he believed Claire held him back from becoming unstoppable. Investors loved ambitious men without emotional distractions. Vanessa Hale made sure he heard that idea. Repeatedly. Vanessa with her designer dresses and sharp smiles and endless whispers about how Claire was too soft for his world. Too emotional. Too ordinary. Ethan believed her. Worse than that, he allowed himself to believe success mattered more than loyalty. Now he watched security footage of the woman he abandoned quietly struggling to stand after 12-hour shifts while carrying his child alone through New York winter nights. Then suddenly the screen changed again. Claire was inside an employee restroom gripping the edge of the sink. Her shoulders shook silently. She was crying. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just exhausted tears from someone trying to survive long enough to make it to tomorrow. Ethan stopped breathing when he saw her pull out the same ultrasound photo and whisper something while touching it gently. The security manager lowered his eyes respectfully. Ethan stepped closer to the monitor. Claire's lips moved slowly through tears. "I promise you," she whispered to the baby. "I will keep going, even if I have to do it alone." The next morning Manhattan woke beneath freezing rain and gray skies, but Ethan Whitmore had not slept for even a single hour. The footage from the security cameras replayed inside his mind over and over like punishment. Claire eating instant noodles beside a vending machine. Claire rubbing her swollen feet alone at 3 in the morning. Claire whispering promises to an unborn child while trying not to cry. By sunrise, the billionaire who once controlled entire industries looked like a man barely holding himself together. His penthouse overlooking Central Park felt unbearably silent. The marble kitchen counters remained untouched. Expensive coffee sat cold beside floor-to-ceiling windows while New York traffic crawled below like tiny moving lights. Ethan stood motionless with one hand against the glass, remembering another winter morning years ago, when Claire danced barefoot through this same apartment wearing one of his oversized sweaters while snow fell outside. "This place never feels empty when you are here," he told her once. Back then she smiled and kissed his cheek before placing a tiny pair of baby socks on the kitchen counter as a joke. They had been trying for a child for almost a year. Ethan remembered laughing while pretending to panic about becoming a father. God! The memory nearly destroyed him now. His phone buzzed endlessly with calls from investors, lawyers, and board members asking why the investor summit had suddenly been cancelled overnight. Ethan ignored all of them. None of it mattered anymore. Around 10 in the morning he walked into the Whitmore Regency again without security, without assistance, without the carefully controlled image he usually carried like armor. Employees immediately straightened when they saw him crossing the lobby. But Ethan did not look at anyone except the front desk manager. "Where is Claire Donovan?" The manager hesitated nervously. "She clocked out at 7 this morning, sir." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Address?" "Sir, company policy, address." 10 minutes later Ethan sat alone in the back of a black SUV, while rain streaked across the windows. The driver moved farther downtown, away from luxury towers and expensive storefronts, into older neighborhoods where rent signs hung crooked in apartment windows and grocery stores advertised coffee for 99 cents. Ethan stared silently outside, realizing something painful. He had spent years building hotels for wealthy strangers while the woman he once loved was surviving in places he had not looked at in years. Claire's apartment building stood between a laundromat and a closed pharmacy with flickering lights. The brick walls were stained from decades of winter storms. A broken elevator sign hung beside the entrance. Ethan looked up slowly at the narrow windows above him and felt physically sick imagining Claire climbing stairs every day while pregnant after 12-hour shifts. The landlord recognized him immediately. Everyone recognized Ethan Whitmore eventually. "You here for Claire?" the older woman asked carefully. Ethan nodded once. "Apartment for B," she answered softly. "She is a good girl. Never complains. Always pays late but somehow pays." Pays late. The words echoed inside him like another accusation. Ethan climbed 4 flights of narrow stairs until he reached apartment 4B. For several seconds he simply stared at the faded white door. He remembered opening massive penthouse doors for Claire with flowers in his hands. Now he stood outside a tiny apartment she probably could barely afford while carrying his child alone. He knocked quietly. No answer. He knocked again. Silence. Then finally the door opened just a few inches. Claire stood there wearing an oversized sweatshirt and soft gray sweatpants. Her hair was loosely tied back and exhaustion shadowed her face. She looked startled for half a second before her expression closed immediately. "How did you find me?" she asked softly. Ethan looked past her shoulder unintentionally. The apartment was painfully small. A twin-sized bed pushed against one wall. Folded baby clothes stacked neatly beside a second-hand crib that still needed assembling. Instant ramen cups near the sink. Prenatal vitamins beside unpaid bills. A tiny ultrasound picture taped carefully to the refrigerator with a handwritten note beneath it. "We will survive this together." Ethan felt something inside his chest crack open completely. Claire noticed where he was looking and stepped in front of the doorway slightly. "You should not be here." Ethan swallowed hard. "Claire, why did you never tell me?" Her eyes hardened instantly. "Tell you what?" "About the baby." The silence between them stretched painfully long. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while distant sirens echoed through the street below. Claire finally looked away first. "Because you already made your choice 2 years ago." Ethan stepped closer slowly. "I did not know." Claire let out a quiet laugh filled with exhaustion instead of humor. "You never asked?" The sentence hit him harder than any scream ever could. Ethan remembered the divorce night perfectly now. Vanessa standing beside him whispering that Claire would only trap him with a child. Investors already questioning whether Ethan was becoming too emotional, too distracted, too domestic. So Ethan chose ambition. He chose appearances. He chose pride. And Claire walked away carrying a secret heartbeat he never bothered to notice. Ethan's voice became almost unrecognizable when he finally spoke again. "Is the baby mine?" Claire stared at him in disbelief for several seconds before tears quietly filled her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Not angry tears. Just the exhausted heartbreak of a woman who suddenly realized the man she once trusted completely had truly never understood her at all. Claire's eyes shimmered with disbelief as she stood in the narrow doorway protecting the tiny apartment behind her like it was the only thing she had left in the world. Outside, rainwater slid down the fire escape, while distant car horns echoed through Manhattan streets below. Ethan could barely breathe beneath the weight of what he had just asked. "Is the baby mine?" The question itself sounded monstrous now. Claire looked away from him slowly and wrapped both arms around her stomach, as if shielding the child from something dangerous. "Maybe from him." "You really think I would lie about something like that?" she asked quietly. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because deep down he already knew the answer. Claire Donovan was many things. Gentle. Loyal. Stubborn sometimes. But never dishonest. Never cruel. Never the kind of person who played games with love or family. That was one of the reasons he fell in love with her in the first place. 2 years ago she still believed people meant what they promised. Ethan remembered their wedding day suddenly with painful clarity. Claire standing beneath warm summer lights in a simple ivory dress whispering vows with tears in her eyes while holding his hands tightly enough to shake. "No matter what success brings us," she told him back then. "Promise me we never become strangers." God. Somehow they became exactly that. Claire stepped farther inside the apartment and left the door half open. Not an invitation. More like exhaustion. Ethan entered quietly and immediately felt out of place inside her world. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender detergent and cheap instant coffee. A small portable heater hummed beside the bed trying to fight the winter cold slipping through old windows. There was no luxury here. No marble. No chandeliers. No assistants waiting nearby. Just survival. Ethan noticed a stack of medical bills beside the sink held together with a rubber band. Prenatal appointments. Blood work. Ultrasounds. Some pages stamped past due in red letters. His stomach turned. "Claire," she interrupted softly. "Do not." Her voice cracked again from exhaustion. "Please do not suddenly act like you care because you saw me cleaning floors in your hotel." Ethan flinched at the truth inside her words. Because she was right. 2 years ago he stopped paying attention to the quiet ways Claire suffered. It happened slowly. Meetings replaced dinners. Business trips replaced anniversaries. Vanessa Hale replaced trust. Vanessa always knew exactly what to say. Claire is too emotional for your world. Claire wants a family before your empire is stable. Claire will make you weak. Ethan believed ambition required sacrifice. He just never realized the sacrifice would become the one person who loved him before the money did. Claire moved carefully toward the kitchenette and reached for a glass of water. Ethan immediately noticed how tired she looked. Her hand trembled slightly while lifting the glass. "How far along are you?" he asked quietly. 32 weeks. 32 weeks. Ethan did the math instantly. The baby was conceived shortly before the divorce. Before the lawyers. Before the headlines announcing the separation of Manhattan's golden billionaire couple. Claire drank slowly before speaking again. "I found out 3 days after I left." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. 3 days. While he was already attending investor dinners with Vanessa smiling beside him for cameras, Claire had been staring at a pregnancy test alone. The image made him feel physically ill. "Why did you not tell me?" he whispered. Claire laughed softly again, but this time tears escaped down her cheeks. "Because you made it very clear there was no room for me in your future anymore." Ethan looked down at the floor, unable to defend himself. She was right again. He remembered the final fight now. Claire standing near the penthouse windows begging him to stop listening to people who only cared about money and appearances. Ethan accusing her of trying to trap him emotionally. Claire crying quietly while removing her wedding ring. He had not chased after her when she left. Not even once. The silence inside the apartment stretched painfully until Ethan noticed something near the crib. A folded white baby blanket. Tiny embroidered letters stitched carefully across the corner. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before his voice failed him completely. You used my initials." Claire followed his gaze and instinctively moved toward the crib. "I was not sure if I should keep them," she admitted softly. "Some nights I hated you for what happened. Other nights..." Her voice faded. Ethan looked at her slowly. "Other nights what?" Claire touched the blanket gently. "Other nights I remembered the man who used to talk to my stomach every night before bed because he was excited to become a father someday." Ethan felt his chest collapse inward. He remembered that version of himself too. Before pride. Before money consumed everything human inside him. Before he allowed outsiders to poison his marriage. Then suddenly Claire winced quietly and grabbed the edge of the counter. Ethan stepped forward instantly. "Claire?" She inhaled sharply before forcing herself upright again. "It is nothing. That did not look like nothing. It is just stress." Ethan stared at her pale face and trembling hands while rain battered the apartment windows harder outside. And for the first time in his entire life, the billionaire who controlled hotels, private jets, and boardrooms realized something terrifying. Claire Donovan had been carrying not only his child alone for 8 months. She had been carrying heartbreak heavy enough to destroy a person and somehow still found the strength to survive. The heater beside the bed clicked softly as freezing rain continued hitting the apartment windows, but Ethan barely noticed the cold anymore. His attention stayed fixed on Claire as she stood near the tiny kitchen counter trying to steady her breathing without letting him see how exhausted she truly was. She looked smaller somehow inside the oversized sweatshirt, yet stronger at the same time. Strong in the way people become when life gives them no other option. Ethan had spent years believing power came from control, wealth, and influence. Now he realized real strength looked like a pregnant woman surviving heartbreak alone in a 4th-floor apartment, while still whispering promises of hope to an unborn child. Claire slowly lowered herself into the chair beside the small folding table and closed her eyes briefly. Ethan noticed how carefully she moved, how every shift of her body carried hidden discomfort she tried to disguise. "Have you seen a doctor recently?" he asked quietly. Claire nodded once without looking at him. "Last week. And medical insurance in America is very expensive when your billionaire husband divorces you before you can renew coverage." The words were calm, but they cut straight through him. Ethan sat down across from her slowly. The tiny table felt absurdly small between them compared to the massive conference tables where he usually made billion-dollar decisions. Somehow this conversation felt infinitely more terrifying. Claire stared down at the cup of water in her hands. The doctor said stress is not good for the baby. Ethan almost laughed bitterly at the cruelty of that statement. Stress. As if stress was some small inconvenience instead of the thing that had quietly consumed both their lives. Claire, he said carefully, I never wanted this for you. She finally looked up at him then, and the sadness in her eyes nearly destroyed him. That is the problem, Ethan. You stopped wanting me at all. Silence swallowed the room. Somewhere downstairs a siren echoed faintly through the wet streets of Manhattan. Ethan looked around the apartment again, forcing himself to truly see it this time instead of glancing through it. Tiny baby socks folded neatly beside the crib. Coupons clipped from grocery store ads. A pregnancy book with sticky notes marking important pages. Everything inside this apartment carried evidence of Claire trying to prepare for motherhood completely alone. Then his eyes stopped on something near the bookshelf. A framed photograph. Ethan stood slowly and picked it up before he could stop himself. It was an old picture from 4 years ago. Claire sat on a blanket in Central Park smiling into the sunlight, while Ethan held her from behind. They looked genuinely happy, untouched by suspicion or ambition or outsiders whispering poison into their marriage. Ethan stared at the photo for several long seconds before speaking quietly. Why would you keep this? Claire's voice softened almost painfully. Because throwing away photographs does not erase memories. Ethan lowered the frame slowly. God. She still loved pieces of him after everything. That realization hurt worse than anger ever could. His phone suddenly buzzed inside his coat pocket. Vanessa Hale. Ethan stared at the name across the screen while something cold settled inside his chest. Claire noticed immediately and looked away. You should answer, she said quietly. Ethan declined the call without hesitation. Then another message appeared instantly afterward. Investors are asking questions. Call me immediately. Ethan turned the phone face down on the table. For the first time in years, he did not care what investors wanted. Claire watched him silently before speaking again. You do not have to pretend here. Pretend? The guilt. The concern. The regret. She swallowed hard before continuing. You already moved on a long time ago. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Claire, I never stopped thinking about you. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Thinking about someone and showing up for them are not the same thing. Every sentence from her felt like another mirror forced in front of him. Because she was right. Again. Ethan thought about Claire constantly after the divorce. But he never called. Never searched for her. Never wondered if she was surviving. He assumed she would land safely somewhere because wealthy people often convince themselves heartbreak is temporary for everyone else. Meanwhile, Claire had been climbing 4 flights of stairs every night carrying his child while he attended champagne dinners under crystal chandeliers. The shame of it sat heavily inside his chest now. Then suddenly Claire inhaled sharply again. This time the pain was stronger. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, while the other instinctively covered her stomach. Ethan stood instantly. Claire. She shook her head quickly. Do not panic. You are in pain. It happens sometimes. How long has this been happening? Claire hesitated too long. Ethan felt fear crawl through him immediately. Claire. Her eyes filled slowly with tears she could no longer hide. Since last month. Ethan's heartbeat slowed unnaturally. What did the doctor say? Claire looked down at her hands. That exhaustion can trigger complications if I do not rest more. Ethan stared at her in horror. Then why are you still working double shifts? Claire laughed quietly through tears now, and the sound shattered whatever remained of his old world. Because babies do not wait for people to heal emotionally before they arrive. Ethan could not breathe for a moment. He looked around the apartment again. The unpaid bills. The weak heater. The second-hand crib. The woman carrying his child while quietly destroying herself trying to survive. Then, finally, Claire whispered the sentence that broke him completely. I was trying very hard not to need you anymore. Claire's words hung in the tiny apartment long after she stopped speaking. I was trying very hard not to need you anymore. Ethan felt them settle deep inside his chest like something sharp and permanent. For years he believed heartbreak was loud. Screaming. Fighting. Slamming doors. But sitting across from Claire now, he realized the worst kind of heartbreak was quiet. It was a woman teaching herself how to survive without the person she once trusted most. Outside, the rain finally slowed to a cold drizzle against the windows. Inside apartment 4B, the silence between them felt unbearably fragile. Ethan looked at Claire carefully. Her eyes were tired beyond exhaustion now. Not just physically. Spiritually. Like someone who spent months carrying fear alone because there was nobody left safe enough to lean on. Then suddenly her phone buzzed softly on the kitchen counter. Claire reached for it quickly, but Ethan saw the hospital name flash across the screen before she turned it over. Manhattan Women's Medical Center. You missed another appointment? He asked quietly. Claire avoided his eyes. I rescheduled. For when? Next month. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Claire, you are 32 weeks pregnant. I know how pregnant I am, Ethan. Her voice cracked slightly from frustration. I also know what prenatal visits cost without proper insurance. Ethan felt guilt flood through him so intensely it almost made him dizzy. This woman was postponing medical care to survive financially while carrying his child. His child. The reality still echoed through him every few seconds like a shockwave he could not process fast enough. Ethan stood abruptly and walked toward the apartment window, trying to breathe through the pressure building in his chest. Below them, people hurried through wet sidewalks holding umbrellas against the cold. Somewhere out there the city kept moving normally while his entire world collapsed inside a fourth-floor apartment no bigger than one of his hotel suites. Claire, he said finally without turning around. Why did you never ask me for help? Claire looked down at her hands for a long moment before answering. Because I needed to keep at least one piece of my dignity. Ethan closed his eyes. God. He did this to her. Not through cruelty alone, but through neglect. Through pride. Through choosing ambition over tenderness until the woman he loved no longer felt safe enough to ask him for help carrying his own child. Ethan turned back toward her slowly. You should never have gone through this alone. Claire gave him a faint, exhausted smile that somehow hurt more than anger. But I did. Another silence settled over the room. Then Ethan noticed something near the stack of medical bills. A small notebook with handwritten budgeting calculations covering every page. Rent. Groceries. Bus fare. Prenatal vitamins. Baby formula estimates. Every dollar accounted for with painful precision. Ethan picked it up carefully. Claire, do not! She stood suddenly, embarrassed now. Please do not look at that. But Ethan already had. Tiny notes filled the margins beside the numbers. Skip lunch Thursday. Overtime Friday night. Delay electric payment 1 week. Ethan's chest tightened so hard he thought something inside him might actually break. Claire had once planned charity galas with him worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now she was calculating whether she could afford both groceries and heat in the same week. Ethan lowered the notebook slowly. You were starving yourself. Claire folded her arms protectively across her stomach. I was budgeting. You are carrying a baby. I know that. Then why would you skip meals? Claire looked away immediately, which answered him before she even spoke. Ethan ran a hand across his face, trying to steady himself. Claire, this is not survival. This is destroying yourself. Tears gathered in her eyes again, but this time exhaustion outweighed pride. What was I supposed to do? She whispered. Go back to the billionaire who already decided I was replaceable? Ethan stepped closer instinctively. You were never replaceable. Claire laughed softly through tears. Then why was it so easy for you to let me go? The question shattered him because he did not have an answer anymore. Back then everything felt logical. Investors. Appearances. Vanessa constantly whispering that Claire was holding him back emotionally. Ethan convinced himself he was choosing growth. But standing here now, staring at unpaid medical bills and a woman too exhausted to hide her pain anymore, he finally understood the truth. He had not grown after losing Claire. He had simply become emptier. Then suddenly Claire inhaled sharply again. This time harder. Her hand gripped the edge of the table while the other pressed against her stomach. Ethan moved instantly. Claire? She shook her head while breathing unevenly. It is okay. No, it is not. Ethan reached for her carefully, supporting her arm as another wave of discomfort passed across her face. Claire looked pale again. Too pale. Fear crawled through him immediately. We are going to the hospital. No, Claire, I cannot afford another emergency visit. Ethan stared at her in stunned silence. You would rather stay here in pain than let me help you? Claire's eyes filled with tears as she whispered the most heartbreaking truth of all. I spent 8 months teaching myself not to depend on someone who already walked away once. Ethan stopped breathing for a second because he finally understood something devastating. Claire was not refusing his money because she hated him. She was refusing it because loving him had once cost her everything. For a long moment neither of them moved. The small apartment felt impossibly quiet except for the hum of the portable heater and the distant sound of rainwater dripping from the fire escape outside. Ethan still held Claire's arm gently, afraid that if he let go she might collapse completely. Claire looked exhausted beyond words now. Not weak. Just worn down by months of carrying fear, pride, loneliness, and responsibility all at once. Ethan had spent years believing money solved problems. But standing inside this apartment, he realized there were some damages wealth arrived too late to repair. You should sit down, he said softly. Claire nodded this time, too tired to argue anymore. Ethan guided her carefully back toward the chair while trying to ignore the panic growing inside him every time she winced slightly. He had missed all of this. The doctor visits. The cravings. The sleepless nights. The quiet fear before becoming a parent. Another man might have held her hand through all of it if life had unfolded differently. The thought made Ethan physically sick. Claire leaned back slowly and closed her eyes for a second. Her breathing steadied again, but the color had not fully returned to her face. Ethan knelt beside the chair instinctively, looking up at her the way he used to years ago when they were still building a future together instead of surviving separate lives. Claire, he said quietly, please let me help you now. Her eyes opened slowly. Why? The single word hit harder than any accusation. Ethan swallowed. Because I should have been here from the beginning. Claire studied his face carefully like she was trying to decide whether the man kneeling in front of her still existed, or if he was only guilt wearing Ethan Whitmore's face. Do you know what the hardest part was? She asked softly after a long silence. Ethan shook his head. Claire looked toward the crib near the wall. Every night I talked to the baby and tried to explain why their father was not there. Ethan's chest tightened so violently he could barely inhale. Claire continued quietly, tears filling her eyes again. I would sit beside that crib after work with swollen feet and tell this little person stories about the man you used to be. Because I did not want our child growing up believing they were unwanted. Ethan lowered his head immediately, overcome by shame so deep it almost felt unbearable. Claire had protected his image for the baby even after he shattered her heart. God! What kind of woman still carried that much grace after everything? Ethan looked up again slowly. You never hated me? Claire gave a sad smile. I tried. The honesty in those 2 words nearly destroyed him. Ethan remembered all the nights after the divorce when he convinced himself Claire would move on quickly. She was smart, kind, beautiful. Someone would eventually love her better than he did. Meanwhile, he buried himself deeper into work because ambition was easier than grief. But grief never disappeared. It simply waited quietly in empty penthouses and silent mornings until one random night in a hotel lobby forced it to breathe again. Claire shifted uncomfortably in the chair and pressed a hand against her lower back once more. Ethan noticed immediately. How much sleep are you getting? She hesitated. Enough. Claire. She sighed softly. 3 or 4 hours most nights. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. That is not enough for you or the baby. I know. Then why are you still taking overtime shifts? Claire looked embarrassed now. The heating bill doubled this winter. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Heating bill. His entire world used to revolve around acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Claire's world revolved around choosing between heat and rest while carrying his child. The contrast made him feel ashamed of everything he once considered important. Then suddenly Claire inhaled sharply again. This time her hand gripped the edge of the chair harder than before. Ethan stood immediately. We are going to the hospital now. Claire shook her head quickly despite the pain crossing her face. It will pass. No. His voice became firm for the first time. I am not leaving you here like this. Claire looked frightened suddenly, but not of him. Of depending on him again. Ethan understood that now. Trust once broken becomes terrifying to hand back. Claire, he said gently, kneeling beside her once more. I know I do not deserve another chance. Maybe I never will. But please do not punish yourself trying to prove you can survive without me. Tears slid silently down her cheeks while she stared at him. Ethan reached into his coat pocket slowly and pulled out something small wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Claire frowned softly as he unfolded it in his palm. A tiny pair of white baby socks. The same pair she joked about years ago in their penthouse kitchen before everything fell apart. Ethan's voice almost broke completely. I kept these. Claire stopped breathing for a second. Ethan looked at the socks in his trembling hands. I told myself I forgot about us. But I never threw these away. Claire covered her mouth quietly as tears spilled down her face now without resistance. The room suddenly felt heavy with memories either of them escaped. Then, before Ethan could say another word, Claire suddenly gasped softly and bent forward in pain. Ethan's entire body went cold instantly. Claire? She grabbed his sleeve tightly for the first time since he arrived. Fear filled her eyes now. Real fear. Ethan, she whispered shakily. I think something is wrong. The fear in Claire's voice erased every remaining wall inside Ethan Whitmore instantly. 1 second earlier he had been standing in a cramped apartment holding tiny baby socks in trembling hands. The next second nothing in the world mattered except the terrified woman gripping his sleeve while trying not to panic. Look at me, Ethan said softly as he crouched beside her. Breathe slowly. Claire nodded weakly, but her fingers tightened around his coat again as another wave of discomfort crossed her face. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking. He had spoken before world leaders, investors, and reporters with perfect control. But seeing Claire frightened while carrying their child shattered every illusion of control he ever had. We are going to the hospital, he said firmly. This time. Claire did not argue. She simply closed her eyes for a second like she no longer had enough energy left to fight him. 10 minutes later Ethan carefully guided Claire into the back seat of his SUV, while cold rain misted across the Manhattan streets. The city lights blurred against wet windows as traffic crawled through downtown. Ethan sat beside her instead of in front for the first time in years. He held her hand the entire drive even though he was not sure he still had the right to. Claire leaned back against the seat, breathing slowly while one hand rested protectively over her stomach. The silence between them no longer felt angry now. Just fragile. Tired. Human. I am sorry, Ethan whispered quietly as the city passed outside. Claire kept staring ahead for several seconds before answering. For which part? Ethan swallowed hard. There were too many answers. Sorry for believing outsiders instead of her. Sorry for letting ambition poison their marriage. Sorry for not noticing she was pregnant. Sorry for every lonely night she climbed apartment stairs carrying his child, while he slept inside luxury towers believing success meant he had won something. For all of it, he admitted finally. Claire looked down at their hands. The hardest part was not losing the marriage. Ethan turned toward her slowly. Then what was it? Tears gathered quietly in her eyes again. Realizing the one person who promised to protect me became the person I felt safest surviving without. Ethan looked away immediately because hearing the truth spoken that gently somehow hurt even more. The hospital entrance glowed beneath white emergency lights as the SUV pulled forward. Nurses quickly brought Claire inside while Ethan followed close behind, feeling strangely helpless in the bright hallway filled with monitors, rolling carts, and quiet medical voices. Everything smelled like antiseptic and coffee and fear. Claire was taken for evaluation, while Ethan waited outside the examination room alone for the first time in his adult life without knowing how to fix something with money or influence. Minutes stretched endlessly. Ethan sat with his elbows on his knees staring at the polished hospital floor while memories crashed through him one after another. Claire asleep against his shoulder during flights to Paris. Claire laughing in grocery store aisles because she insisted wealthy people still overpaid for cereal. Claire crying quietly during the divorce while Ethan convinced himself walking away was the smart decision. God. He had mistaken temporary ambition for permanent value. A doctor finally stepped out of the room holding a chart. Ethan stood instantly. How is she? The baby is stable, the doctor said calmly. Ethan nearly collapsed with relief. But Ms. Donovan is severely exhausted and showing signs of stress-related complications. She needs rest immediately. Rest. Such a simple word. Yet Claire had spent 8 months denying herself even that. The doctor continued carefully. She also mentioned she has been working overnight shifts. Ethan nodded slowly, ashamed. Not anymore. An hour later, Ethan quietly entered Claire's room. She looked smaller beneath the hospital blankets somehow, but calmer now. A monitor beside the bed played the steady rhythm of the baby's heartbeat through the room. Ethan froze the second he heard it clearly for the first time. Thump. 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 Fast. Tiny. Alive. His child. Claire watched his face carefully as tears silently filled his eyes before he could stop them. Ethan moved closer to the bed slowly. That is our baby? Claire nodded once. Ethan stared at the monitor like nothing else existed anymore. All those meetings. All those awards. All those luxury towers with his name across the top. None of them had ever made him feel something this overwhelming. Claire touched her stomach gently beneath the blanket. The baby likes music, she whispered softly after a while. Ethan looked at her. Really? A faint smile appeared on Claire's tired face for the first time that night. Every time piano music played in the hotel lobby, the baby started moving. Ethan closed his eyes briefly because the image nearly broke him completely. Their child already knew pieces of his world while surviving inside hers. Then Claire looked at him quietly and asked the question neither of them could escape anymore. What happens now? Ethan sat beside her carefully. For once the billionaire who always had answers said nothing immediately. Because this was not about contracts or reputation or pride anymore. This was about whether love could survive after being abandoned. Ethan reached carefully for her hand again. I do not know if I deserve another chance, he admitted honestly. Maybe I never will. Claire stayed silent. Ethan looked toward the heartbeat monitor softly echoing through the room. But I know one thing. He turned back toward her slowly, eyes filled with the kind of regret money could never erase. I spent 2 years building bigger hotels while the only home I ever truly wanted was already walking away from me.